So with that, I'll turn things over to the prosecutor.
Thursday, June 25th, 2015, almost 2 years ago now, a woman named Bonnie Flynn was walking her dog on the beach, Deer Island, in winter, here. As she did, she made a horrifying discovery. She noticed that her dog had found a tightly knitted trash bag on the beach, and the dog was circling around and around and sniffing at the bag. Ms. Flynn went to try to get someone to help her. She had a sinking feeling that something wasn't right about that bag. She couldn't find anyone to help her, so she went back to the bag and, using a shell that she retrieved from the beach, cut the bag open ever so slightly. What she found was the lifeless body of a young child. The little girl was wearing no shoes. She had on black and white zebra print leggings, nothing on top. She was wrapped in 2 blankets and then tied tightly in 2 separate garbage bags. Her body had begun to decompose. Ms. Flynn rushed to other people that she saw at the beach and asked them to use her cell phone so that she could call the police, and they came along with other first responders. No one knew who the girl was. She didn't match any missing persons report. No one had called in a missing child recently. She was alone and unclaimed. Whoever had killed her and stuffed her in those bags had taken not only her life, and then she got an apartment through public benefits. She got an apartment on Maxwell Street in Dorchester. Ms. Bond was delighted with the apartment. She loved having her own space. She loved being able to cook meals for herself and for Bella. She loved to be able to run with Bella and play up at the length of the apartment. You know how this sense of it's a fairly long, skinny apartment. She liked taking Bella to the nearby park. And although she still struggled with addiction, she had resolved to stay clean in order to try to create a stable home for Bella. Sometimes you'll hear she allowed friends of hers from the street who didn't have homes of their own to come and crash for a night or 2 or even a week sometimes. And on 2 occasions, men lived with her as her boyfriends for a period of several weeks or even a couple months before the defendant came into the picture. And yes, you will hear that during that period of time, Ms. Bond sold medication that doctors prescribed for her to treat her addiction, sold it so that she could afford things for Bella and herself that she otherwise couldn't afford. As sometimes unpredictable as Bella's life might be, the evidence will show that her mother loved the girl and was doing her best within her limits to provide her with a stable home. In late February of 2015, however, the defendant came into their lives. He and Ms. Bond had met earlier that winter outside a pharmacy and talked for a little while, hit it off, and exchanged cell phone numbers. And in late February of 2015, the defendant texted Ms. Bond and asked if he could come over. She imagined that he was looking to buy drugs from her. There was a raging snowstorm, and she said if he could make it over, he could come, and he did. And they talked through the night, and he spent the night that night. And he lived in that apartment from late February of 2015 until his arrest for Bella Bond's murder in September of 2015. Initially, Ms. Bond liked the defendant very much. She thought he was intelligent. She thought he was interesting. She was particularly fascinated with his interest in the supernatural, in alternative spirituality. and in the spiritual healing practice called Reiki, as well as other aspects of the occult that interested her as well. She noted she was impressed when, on meeting him, not long after he started living in the apartment, he said he detected an evil spirit in the apartment, something that she herself had felt over time. And he told her that the way to get rid of an evil spirit in a home was to spread sage around the apartment to ward off evil spirits. And with Ms. Bond's permission, he did that practice of saging the house. And she felt as if it had some effect on the evil spirit that both he and she had felt there. Not long after that, she was even more impressed with his Reiki spirituality, his Reiki healing, when she was experiencing abdominal pains that stemmed from abdominal surgery she had had the year before. And the defendant told her that if she got in touch with the chakras in her body, healed special healing points, and imagined the proper color that was associated with each chakra, that it would address the pain. He walked her through this process, and within a very short time, she felt relief from the abdominal pain. Only more evidence to her that he had special qualities about him that appealed to her. And in fact, over time, especially early on, Ms. Bond came to feel that she and the defendant had a connection. They had a relationship. And that she could envision being with him for a period of time and living with him and Bella as a family. They even talked about marriage. Ms. Bond knew that the defendant didn't have any experience caring for children or living with children. But she also knew that the defendant seemed to like Bella and that she seemed to like him and the dog, Bailey, that he kept with him at all times. Ms. Bond didn't see any interactions between the defendant and Bella that concerned her. And she thought, this could work. Unfortunately, you will also hear from the testimony of several witnesses that the defendant's addiction to heroin and Ms. Bond's history of heroin addiction reinforced each other. And gradually, over time, what had started out as a good relationship degenerated into a cycle of increasing heroin use. The tragic night that brings us all here to this court was not that different from any other night in the Bond household. It was sometime probably in mid-June. And one of the frustrating things I anticipate for you as jurors in this case will be realizing that people with serious substance abuse and addiction problems often have difficulty being precise about dates and times. People who don't work regularly, people who don't have to get up at a certain time to be at a certain place, people who don't keep date books and appointment calendars, often, and people who are using heroin at the same time as all that, often aren't able to say with precision what happened exactly when. And in fact, I think one of the things that you will experience in this case is that the evidence will show you that most of the major players in this case had damaged themselves with drugs. Some of them almost literally hollowing themselves out with substances. And the evidence will take you to a place that for many of you, perhaps most of you, will be very strange, very unfamiliar and foreign. The world of the homeless and the chronically addicted. But I'll ask you nonetheless to listen to that evidence through the confusion, through the haze of drugs, to find what the facts are. And the facts that you will learn about that night are that it was a night pretty much like any other night. Ms. Bond and the defendant were in the living room of the apartment, and Bella, who Ms. Bond was trying to make the transition between sleeping in a pack-and-play in her mother's room, where the defendant also slept, to her own small bed in the back bedroom, which was supposed to be her bedroom. And each night, Ms. Bond would go through the ritual of taking Bella to the bed and putting her in and tucking her in and telling her a story or singing to her, trying to get her to go to sleep, coming back out to the living room, whereupon Bella would get out of bed and come right back into the living room to be with Ms. Bond and the defendant. And that night, this had happened several times. This nightly ritual had gone on several times. When Ms. Bond asked the defendant if he would be willing to take Bella and put her down to bed, he actually was better at things like that than Ms. Bond. Bella listened to him more. He was stricter with her. He told Ms. Bond repeatedly that she needed to be stricter with the child so that she would grow up right and learn. And Ms. Bond asked the defendant if he would go into her bedroom and help her get to sleep. He agreed. He went into the bedroom, and Ms. Bond remained in the living room. When she didn't hear anything for several minutes, she went into the bedroom, Bella's bedroom, to see what was going on, to see what the two of them were doing. She wasn't suspicious. She just was curious what was happening. She got up from the couch in the living room, walked across to the back bedroom door. She saw that the door was open and the light was still on, and she went in. What she saw appalled her. Bella was lying across the mattress on her back. Not along the mattress as you would expect if someone was sleeping, but across the mattress on her back. The defendant was either kneeling or crouching over her, and as Ms. Bond entered the room, the defendant struck Bella hard in the abdomen. The force of the blow was enough to bounce Bella's body a bit on the mattress. But other than that, the girl didn't respond at all to the blow to the stomach. Ms. Bond screamed at the defendant, "What are you doing?" and rushed over to Bella. She saw that Bella's face was either blue or gray. She wasn't breathing. She appeared lifeless. Ms. Bond attempted to perform CPR on her daughter because years and years ago, when she was young, she had been trained in CPR. She tried to perform CPR on her to no effect whatsoever. And after several minutes of trying that, she picked her daughter up. She wasn't sure where she was going to take her. She just picked her up to take her out of the room. And the defendant stopped her. He wouldn't let her take Bella out of the room. He made her put Bella down, and then he grabbed her around the neck and said to her, "If you tell anyone what happened, I will kill you." And he told her then, when she asked him, "What did you do?" he said, "She just died. It was her time. She was a demon." Ms. Bond struggled against him, but he strangled her into unconsciousness. And when she woke up, she was on the couch in the living room. She was sick, physically sick, confused, weak from being strangled, and she stumbled into the bathroom. The defendant watched her use the bathroom and stayed there. She went back to the couch and sat and tried to decide what she should do. She was terrified. And as she did, she heard the defendant rummaging through plastic bags under the sink. As she looked over, the defendant came to her, and he had a needle with heroin in it. And he injected her in her neck. And it was an injection that she welcomed, because at that moment, it eased her psychological pain. From that point on, you will hear Rochelle Bond gave in fully to her addiction. Her memory of the hours, days, and weeks that followed is hazy, blurred by heroin use, and by, well, you'll hear all the things that she'll tell you that blurred her judgment at that time. But it was primarily heroin use. She remembers that either hours or perhaps as many as a day or two after the murder, the defendant took her by the arm from the living room and out to the car, his car, which was parked outside. He told her to get in, and when she did, she saw on the back seat a duffel bag that she used for laundry. And in it, she could see the contour of her daughter's thigh. She knew who was in that bag. On the floor of the car, near the bag, were two weights, like barbells that people put on bars so that they can lift weights. There were two weights. And when she began to cry and to scream at him, he struck her, either with his fist or an item, she's not sure. But she was dazed. She sat quietly dazed as he drove to an area in South Boston, the Reserve Channel. South Boston being where the defendant had grown up, and he drove her to a very remote location here, the south side of the Reserve Channel. When they got there, she realized that he was no longer, after he parked the car, he was no longer in the car, and neither was the bag or the weights. He came back a short time later, empty-handed, and she knew what he had done with her daughter's body. Then they drove home to the apartment that they shared. Rochelle Bond will testify in this case. She'll come to court and take the stand. And she'll be testifying pursuant to a cooperation agreement. A cooperation agreement that required her to plead guilty, to acknowledge her guilt as an accessory after the fact to her daughter's murder, as well as to larceny over $250 for fraudulently accepting public assistance benefits on Bella's behalf, even after Bella was dead. And the cooperation agreement requires her to testify. In return, at the conclusion of this trial, she will be sentenced to a sentence that releases her from incarceration and requires her to begin a 5-year probationary period. Ms. Bond will come before you and she will explain her conduct in the minutes, hours, days, and weeks that followed her daughter's murder. And I expect she will testify, and the evidence will show that she didn't report that murder immediately because she was afraid of the defendant, who had just killed her daughter, who had just strangled her, and who in the weeks afterwards was both verbally and physically abusive to her. You will see the evidence of him attempting to control her over the telephone, by text message, and in person. I also expect that she will testify that she was afraid that not having reported the murder in the immediate aftermath of the crime, that people would ask her questions that she simply couldn't answer. What would she say about why she didn't report the murder? It was the tyranny of a single decision in a single chaotic night. And finally, I expect that she'll testify that she was afraid that if she left the defendant, or if he left her, that she would be alone without anyone in the world with whom she could discuss her guilty secret and her predicament. Her moral, ethical, and yes, legal predicament. Many of you, perhaps most or even all of you, will be asking, how could a mother, regardless of the defendant's violence or threats, how could a mother not report a murder immediately? Many, perhaps most or all of you, will ask, how could she live with that guilty secret for days and weeks and months after the crime? These are valid questions, and they're questions with which you will have to wrestle. And you will have to answer these questions based on all the evidence that you will hear in this trial. And I suspect that at the end of the case, you will conclude that Ms. Bond was at root trapped. Trapped by the defendant's violence, his intimidation and control, but also trapped by her decision to give in to that intimidation, violence, and control. And I expect that you will hear evidence of the ways in which her drug use contributed to that decision to give in to his intimidation and control. You will hear testimony from witnesses in this case about Ms. Bond's life with the defendant, both before and after the murder. And you will hear evidence about his attempts to intimidate or control her, as I said, in person, by text, by phone. And you will hear evidence about her giving into it. And at the end of the day, you will hear that she used heroin to put herself in a state of numbness where she could feel almost no pain at all. Things remained like this until the middle of September 16, 2015, at which point they changed decisively. Because it was on Wednesday, September 9th, 2015, that Joseph Amoroso, the biological father of Bella Bond, came back to Boston and showed up at Rochelle Bond's apartment on Maxwell Street. He had never met his daughter. In fact, he had lived down south for most of the pregnancy and her life. But he had stayed in touch with Rochelle Bond. The relationship was a rocky one. They didn't get along very well at all. There was a lot of conflict. But she did send him regular photos of Bella that she took on her cell phone. And she allowed him on occasion to speak to Bella on the phone, although neither of them told her that he was her father, just identified him as a family friend. But over time, he had made a decision that he wanted to come back to Boston. He wanted to get to know his daughter and be a part of her life. So in late August, he came back, and over the ensuing weeks, he developed the courage. He worked up the courage to go to her apartment and meet his daughter, who by that time was 2.5 years old. Almost, actually by that time would have been 3 years old. When he got to the apartment, he knocked on the door, didn't get an answer. went around the back door, knocked on the door, and finally heard Rochelle Vaughn's voice say, "Who is it?" And he said, identified himself. She came to the back door. She was surprised to see him there. She had no idea that he was coming. And she asked him what he wanted. He said, "I want to see Bella." And Ms. Bond lied to him, said, "She's not here." He said, "Where is she?" She told him that she was at her godparents on the Cape. He asked how long she would be there. Rochelle Vaughn lied and said, "A month." He said, "A month?" He said, "Well, do you have like a phone number where I can call her and figure out how to get down to the Cape?" She said, "No, I don't have their cell phone number." And Joseph Amoroso was suspicious. He didn't know what to make of that, that Rochelle Vaughn would send her daughter somewhere for a month with so much cell phone she didn't have. He was suspicious, and he worried that the Department of Children and Families had taken Bella because Rochelle Vaughn was using drugs again. That was his concern. He didn't suspect the worst. And Ms. Bond, probably understandably, didn't tell him. He went away, but he didn't stay away. A week later, in the early morning hours of Wednesday, September 16, 2015, he came back, and this time it was the very early morning hours, just after midnight. He rang the doorbell repeatedly and couldn't get into the apartment building, so he used the tool to jimmy it open. Went into the apartment and knocked on the door of Rochelle Vaughn's apartment. He knocked and knocked, and finally she came out, and the two of them talked in the stairwell for a short time. Unbeknownst to him, the defendant was behind the apartment door, listening to the conversation with a baseball bat in his hand. Ms. Bond eventually took the conversation out onto the porch, and when he kept asking questions about whether he could stay with her for a period of time, she said no. Whether he could see Bella, she said no. He finally went away. He was angry, and he was suspicious. Later that morning, the defendant drove himself, Ms. Bond, and his lifelong friend Michael Sprinsky to the Boston Medical Center, where he was going to have surgery on an abscess that he had on his wrist. They drove Michael Sprinsky almost all the way to the hospital and then dropped him off to attend a personal errand. But the defendant and Ms. Bond went to the Boston Medical Center. The defendant's plan was for Ms. Bond to feed the meter so that his car wouldn't get towed and also take care of his dog Bailey. But Ms. Bond didn't want to do it. There was an argument and she left the hospital, leaving him to care for the dog. She went to go buy a cell phone in her own name, something she hadn't had for months after the defendant convinced her that they could save money by sharing only his cell phone. She went to get a cell phone, and as she was walking to the cell phone store at South Bay, she ran into Michael Sprinsky. They talked for a while, and almost without realizing she was doing it, she told him what the defendant had done to Bella, and that she had been with him when he disposed of the body, and that she expected to go to jail as an accessory after the fact to murder. Michael Sprinsky, as I told you earlier, was stunned. He didn't know what to make of it, and after staying with her while she bought a cell phone, he texted the defendant, his lifelong friend, Mike McCarthy. As I said, you'll have a chance to see that text message, hear its tone, and see what's not in it as well. Meanwhile, Ms. Bond, I should tell you that Michael Sprinsky, after he called his sister and she had told him about Baby Doe, he had decided the next day that he would go to the police. He went to the Roxbury District Court, where he knew a probation officer. The probation at Roxbury District Court told him, heard what he had to say, and told him you ought to talk to the police. Michael Sprinsky agreed, and a trooper named Dan Herman came and interviewed him. And that's how Baby Doe was ultimately identified to the public. I apologize. I think I left out earlier when I told you that Michael Sprinsky had gone to the police right after he told his sister. After he did that, that was Thursday morning, the 17th. Still back on Wednesday, after she and Michael Sprinsky had talked, Rochelle Bond met up with Joseph Amoroso again. It wasn't surprising. They were hanging out in an area where a lot of the homeless hang out, often called the Methadone Mile. She ran into Joseph Amoroso and she told him that she had something she had to tell him, something important, but that she couldn't tell him that day. She asked him to walk and talk with her, and they did. They talked about all kinds of things, including talking about Bella as if she were still alive. They spent that day together, walking, talking, and doing drugs. And they spent that night outdoors at the Gillette plant in South Boston. The next day, Mr. Amoroso was still asking what it was that she had to tell him, and she said, I'll tell you, but I need to see my therapist first. And before I go to see my therapist, I want to go back home and take a shower. He agreed. They went to the nearby Ashmont T station. She asked him to wait there for her while she went home to take a shower. She told him that she would stay in touch by text, and she did. She went to her apartment, which was nearby. She took a shower, and as she was getting out of the shower and getting herself ready, she saw 2 state troopers coming up the stairs to her building. They, having talked to Michael Sprinsky earlier in the day, were now looking for both Rochelle Bond and Michael McCarthy, the defendant. When she saw the police coming, she panicked. She fled out the back window of her apartment and ran back to Ashmont Station, where Joseph Amoroso was. There, she told him what the defendant had done to Bella. He was furious, as you might imagine, enraged. He was furious at the defendant for killing little Bella, and he was furious at Rochelle Bond for keeping that secret for so long and not telling anyone about it. He told her that she would have to turn herself in, and she agreed. They then started walking all over town, ending up on the Boston Common, talking about how to get Ms. Bond a lawyer so that she could turn herself in, what she should do in order to turn herself in. And on the Common, they once again got drugs and used them while they were talking. Ultimately, they decided that they would go spend the night at Joseph Amoroso's mother's house in Lynn, where he sometimes stayed when he had nowhere else to live. They made their way to Lynn, where his mother and stepfather were home, and they spent the night together, crying, talking. Ms. Bond turned over her personal belongings to Joseph Amoroso. She gave him the cell phone that she had just bought the day before with Michael Sprinsky. And she gave him also another cell phone, an older cell phone that hadn't been connected to the internet in some time, but which had a lot of pictures of Bella on it that she wanted Joseph Amoroso to have. The next morning, the news media had gotten wind of the story that Baby Doe had been identified and there was an ongoing investigation. And Joseph Amoroso's mother and stepfather were watching a news broadcast about that information. At that point, Rochelle Bond and Joseph Amoroso told his mother and stepfather that that was their granddaughter. Ms. Joseph Amoroso's mother had cared for Bella when she was a very young infant several times and felt bonded to the girl, and everyone broke down in tears. At that point, Joseph Amoroso told them that they were going to turn in Rochelle Bond, and he told her to turn on her cell phone and not to be surprised if the police were on top of them almost immediately as she did it. He imagined that they would be tracing her phone. What he didn't know is that the police were already there staking out the house, and as soon as he and Ms. Bond walked out of the house, the troopers were there to talk to them. The troopers asked Ms. Bond if she would be willing to come with them to their office in Chelsea to give an interview, and she agreed. Mr. Amoroso came with her. Meanwhile, at the same time, the state police troopers were interviewing the defendant in his hospital room at the Beth Israel Hospital, where he had wound up. He'd gone to several hospitals before winding up at the Beth Israel. He hadn't had surgery yet, but he was in the hospital room, and they interviewed him. You will hear, after the interviews, they charged the defendant with the murder of Bella Bond, and they charged Rochelle Bond as an accessory after the fact to her murder. You will hear about those interviews. In particular, you will hear that the defendant denied that he had been involved in Bella's death. In fact, denied any knowledge that she was dead at all. He will tell you that one day he came home to the apartment. Bella wasn't there, and Rochelle Bond told him that DCF had come and taken the child. You'll hear about his interview, you'll hear about her interview, and you'll hear about the investigation that followed. You will hear over the course of this trial a great deal of evidence. In particular, you will learn certain things that are critical. June 26, 2015, and I hope that this is displaying on the monitors in the jury box. On June 26, 2015, the day after Bella Bond's body was found on the beach in Winthrop, Michael McCarthy's cell phone was making calls and traveling along a route in the Seaport District, bouncing off cell towers in the Seaport District. at a speed that indicated that he was in a car, probably the evidence will show with Rochelle Bond, and traveling down the Seaport District on a route that you'll hear is consistent with Summer Street in the Seaport District. And when we go on a view, you'll see that as a car traveling down Summer Street, when you get to the end of Summer Street in the Seaport District, when it turns over into South Boston proper, a person in a car traveling down Summer Street would have a clear, unobscured view of the area of the reserve channel where the defendant dumped Bella Bond's body. You will hear that on July 16, 2015, 3 weeks after Bella Bond's body washed up on Deer Island, Rochelle Bond had to go to housing court. Her landlord was moving to evict her from the apartment because she and the defendant had spent the rent money on drugs. She went to housing court, and you will see text exchange between the defendant and Rochelle Bond as she was in housing court. You will see and hear the tone of the defendant's text messages to her as he repeatedly told her that he doubted she was in court at all. This kind of thing always happened when she got her check. You'll hear the tone in which those email exchanges were made. But even more importantly, you'll hear that on 3 separate occasions, the defendant texted Rochelle Bond as she was in housing court facing an eviction. And you'll hear that he texted her and said, "Do not tell the judge that you have a daughter that you're taking care of." 3 times he texted her that. And each time as he texted her, he said, "Because we don't want DCF to get involved. We don't want those vultures in our lives." And then he texted her, "Text me to make sure that you got those texts." 3 weeks after her body washed up on Deer Island. Then you will hear on September 16, 2015, when Joe Amoroso came back the second time, early in the morning, to look for his daughter, Bella. You will hear that as the defendant listened to the entire conversation armed with a baseball bat, that when Rochelle Bond came back into that apartment, he was enraged at her. You'll hear that from her, and you'll hear that from his lifelong friend, Michael Sprinsky. He's absolutely enraged at her, calling her all sorts of vulgar names. And then you will hear that on September 21st, 2015, 3 days after their interview with Rochelle Bond, and following verbal directions that she gave about where they had driven in South Boston when the defendant dumped her body, Massachusetts State Police divers found weights. They dove in the area that Rochelle Bond had described to the troopers. It was in 12 to 14 feet of water, very near the wall of the channel. They found a waterlogged laundry bag with weights inside of it, the 2 weights that are described on the scene. And they found them within 20 minutes of diving, based on the location she gave. A day later, Massachusetts state troopers executed a search warrant at the defendant's father's plumbing office in Quincy, where the defendant had lived before he went to live on Maxwell Street, and where he sometimes still went to get his mail and attend to other personal matters. And in the basement of that plumbing shop, they found a weightlifting set with a number of different kinds of weights. But significantly, they found this one, which was identical in appearance, brand, manufacturer, and condition to the 2 weights that they had found the day before when they searched, the divers searched the channel in South Boston. In this trial, you will have a chance to hear the defendant's version of events. You will hear it through his interview on September 18th with the Massachusetts State Police in his hospital room. You will hear him deny that he had anything to do with Bella's death. In fact, you'll hear him profess that he has no idea that she's dead. And you will hear the tone of that interview, and I'll ask you to listen carefully to it. And as I said at the beginning of the opening statement, I will also ask you to listen for what is often just as important as what is said, what isn't said. Listen very carefully, both in the testimony of Michael Sprinsky and his text message exchange 2 days earlier with the defendant, and the interview with police 2 days later, Listen carefully for any sign of surprise that Bella's dead. Even more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, when you're listening to his interview with the state troopers and his statements to Michael Sprinsky, listen for any sign of concern. Concern for the child that he had lived with for several months just earlier that year. I expect, ladies and gentlemen, that when you've listened to all the evidence, you will come to the conclusion that Michael McCarthy's statement to the Massachusetts State Police was false, just as his denial to his lifelong friend, Michael Sprinsky, was false. And I believe that you will conclude, based on all the evidence, that the reason he gave false statements, false denials to Michael Sprinsky and to the state police is because he knew that the truth that he had killed Bella Bond and then dumped her body did not set him free. And at the end of this trial, I will come before you and I will ask you, based on all the evidence, to return a verdict against Michael McCarthy for the murder of Bella Bond.
Thank you.